There's rumor of a Dirty Dancing sequel.
When they offer me $10 million for the sequel, which I wish I'd take.
Is this true?
I don't know.
There are stories that live in the spotlight, polished and perfect, exactly the way the world wants to remember them. And then there are the ones told in hushed tones, behind closed doors, in the quiet years, before someone runs out of time to tell them. Patrick Swayze had both kinds. But it was only in his final chapter, when the cameras were gone and the diagnosis had already settled into his bones, that he chose to speak freely. What came out wasn't a fairy tale. It was something rawer, heavier, and far more real than anything he had ever performed on screen. Most people remember him as Johnny Castle, the brooding instructor with the easy smile and the dangerous hips, the man who said the line, the man who did the lift. They remember the fantasy, because that's what Dirty Dancing sold. A perfect summer escape wrapped in sweat and saxophone music. But Patrick Swayze, the actual human being behind that character, lived a version of that film that looked nothing like what ended up on screen. The set was not dreamy. The partnership was not effortless. And the experience left marks on him that took years to fully understand. Before any of that, though, you have to understand where Patrick came from, because his roots explain almost everything about the man he became on that film set. He was born in Houston, Texas, in the summer of 1952, into a house where discipline was the first language anyone learned. His mother, Patsy Swayze, wasn't simply a dance teacher. She was a force. She ran her studio the way a general runs a campaign, with total commitment and zero tolerance for half measures. Patrick grew up inside that world. Not on the edges of it, but deep in its center. He trained in ballet, jazz, and gymnastics, while other boys his age were figuring out how to throw a football. And for a while, he tried to be both, the athlete and the artist, the tough kid who could also leap across a stage without flinching. Football gave him a sense of belonging in a world that sometimes looked sideways at a boy who danced. He threw himself into it completely. But the body doesn't always cooperate with what the mind wants, and a bad tackle took his knee apart in a way that ended that chapter before it had really begun. For most people, an injury like that becomes the pivot point of a sad story. For Patrick, it became a doorway. He stepped through it and kept moving, toward New York, toward ballet academies that didn't care about his name or his hometown, toward a discipline so demanding it made everything he had done before feel like warm-up. He trained with the Joffrey Ballet and the Harkness. He pushed his body to the edge of what it could handle, and then pushed further. There was a moment during those years when it seemed like he might ascend to the very top of the dance world. A partnership with Mikhail Baryshnikov had been discussed, quietly, in the circles where those things get decided. But his knee had other plans. Surgery ended that possibility. And so Patrick Swayze shifted again, the way he always did, not with bitterness, but with motion. He moved toward the stage, then toward the screen. The early years in Hollywood were quiet by most definitions of the word. He appeared in a roller skating film that most people have long forgotten. He played soldiers and gang members and background characters in things that didn't quite catch. But people who worked with him during that period always said the same thing. There was something about him that you couldn't look away from. Not polish, not precision, but something underneath. A weight, an urgency, like he was always performing for something more important than the camera in front of him. And then came 1987, and everything changed in a way that nobody, including Patrick himself, had fully anticipated. Dirty Dancing was not supposed to be a big deal. The studio saw it as a filler project, low budget, low expectations, low risk. Nobody was betting their career on it. But Patrick read the script and felt something stir in him. Johnny Castle, the dance instructor from the wrong side of the resort fence, was not a complicated character on paper. He was a type. But Patrick saw something in that type that he recognized. The outsider trying to matter. The person who has spent his whole life being told that what he does isn't quite enough, isn't quite respectable, isn't quite real. He understood that from the inside out. What he didn't anticipate was how complicated the path to making the film would turn out to be. Jennifer Grey had been cast as Frances, the sheltered teenager the world would come to know as Baby. She and Patrick had history, not the warm, familiar kind, but the kind that leaves a residue. They had worked together before on a Cold War film called Red Dawn, and the experience had not been comfortable. Patrick was intense and exacting, the kind of person who arrived with a plan and expected everyone around him to match his level. Jennifer worked from a completely different place, instinctive, emotional, led by feeling rather than structure. Their energies had clashed, and neither of them had forgotten it. When Jennifer found out Patrick had been cast opposite her in Dirty Dancing, she felt her stomach drop. The memory of that friction came back fast and clear. She didn't want to go through it again. She was vocal about her concerns. But the producers weren't moving. Patrick was the only choice that made sense for the role, and they knew it. What happened next is something Patrick spoke about in the years that followed, and it matters because it tells you everything about who he actually was beneath the image. Before filming began, before a single camera had rolled, he pulled Jennifer aside. Not as an actor, not as a professional making a calculated move, but as a person. He looked at her and he apologized. He told her he understood why she didn't want him there. He acknowledged the tension that had lived between them. And then he simply said he was sorry for whatever part he had played in it. Jennifer later recalled that in that moment, the person she thought she knew disappeared. What was standing in front of her was someone entirely different from the guarded, intense performer she remembered. The walls came down. Something shifted between them. And when they stepped in front of the camera for their screen test, what came through was so electric, so genuinely charged, that the people in that room knew immediately they were witnessing something rare. The discomfort between them had not disappeared. It had transformed into something the lens could feel. But transformation is not the same as resolution, and the weeks that followed were anything but smooth. Filming took place in North Carolina during the kind of summer that makes everything harder than it needs to be. The heat was relentless. Costumes stuck to skin. Tempers had a short fuse. And Patrick was quietly managing something that the production didn't fully know the extent of. His knee, the same one that had already derailed 2 dreams, was in serious pain. He had been dealing with it for years, managing it, working around it, refusing to let it become the story. On the Dirty Dancing set, he pushed through choreography that would have sidelined most people, hiding the discomfort behind every clean, deliberate step. He didn't talk about it. He didn't ask for accommodations. He just kept moving. Jennifer, meanwhile, was carrying her own pressure. She was the emotional center of the film, the character through whose eyes the entire story was told, and the expectations sitting on her shoulders were enormous. Off camera, she struggled to fully relax. Patrick's energy was unpredictable, warm and generous in one moment, cold and withdrawn in the next. The old friction had not vanished. It had simply learned to wear a different face. Their rehearsals were tense in a way that crew members still talk about. Patrick had been trained from childhood to believe that precision was respect, that showing up fully prepared, hitting every mark, nailing every count was the most professional thing a performer could do. When Jennifer struggled with timing or footwork, his frustration was visible, even when he tried to contain it. To him, correction was collaboration. To her, it often felt like control. She was trying to find her way into the role emotionally, and she couldn't always do that on someone else's schedule. Patrick admitted this himself in interviews years later. He didn't dress it up or make himself look better than he was. He said plainly that he had not always understood her process, that his impatience had sometimes gotten the better of him, and that there were days when the tension between them was real and heavy and had nothing to do with the characters they were playing. He said that when Johnny looked frustrated with Baby in a scene, the sharpness behind it wasn't always acting. One particular moment from the filming has become a kind of legend among people who study the making of the film. There is a scene where Patrick's character runs his hand slowly down Jennifer's arm, a quiet, intimate gesture meant to convey desire and restraint at the same time. Jennifer couldn't stop laughing, not because it wasn't working, but because nerves do unpredictable things to people, and hers expressed themselves through laughter. She tried to stop. She couldn't. Patrick was annoyed. He was trying to build something real in that moment, and the giggles kept pulling the floor out from under it. But the director kept the cameras running. And what ended up on screen? Jennifer barely containing herself, Patrick watching her with something between amusement and exasperation, became one of the most genuinely felt moments in the entire film. The accident became the art. Then there was the lift. If you have seen Dirty Dancing even once, you know the lift. The final dance sequence. Jennifer running the full length of the room, Patrick waiting at the end of it, arms open. And then her body rising above his head, suspended in the air, the whole theater holding its breath. It is one of the most iconic images in the history of American cinema. It has been imitated at weddings and school dances and variety shows for decades. And almost nobody who has watched it knows the truth of what it took to get there. Jennifer had never rehearsed it. Not once. Her fear of being dropped was deep and specific, and no amount of reassurance could move it. Patrick, who believed in his bones that repetition was the only path to trust, could not understand why she wouldn't practice. He had the strength. He had the technique. He needed her to show up and let him catch her. And she wouldn't do it ahead of time. It was a standoff between two completely different ways of approaching fear. His was to prepare until the fear had nowhere to live. Hers was to leap and hope the moment itself would be enough. On the day they filmed it, there was no more time for negotiation. The cameras were ready. The crew was watching. The scene had to happen. Patrick stood at one end of the space, and Jennifer stood at the other, and every single thing that had built up between them over weeks of filming, the friction, the apology, the laughter, the frustration, the moments of real warmth and the moments of cold silence, was all sitting in the air between them. She ran. He caught her. She went up. And it was perfect. Not almost perfect. Not good enough for a film with a low budget and modest expectations. Actually, genuinely, breathtakingly perfect. One take. No rehearsal. Pure adrenaline and accumulated feeling, and two people who had been fighting against each other for weeks suddenly, briefly, completely aligned. Patrick said afterward that in that single moment, Jennifer had trusted him entirely. Not because the fear was gone, but because she ran anyway. And he said it was one of the most honest things he had ever been part of. The film came out in 1987 and did something no one in the industry had predicted. It didn't just succeed, it consumed. Theaters were packed. Tapes flew off shelves. A song Patrick had co-written years before the film, sitting quietly in a drawer waiting for the right moment, suddenly became a top 10 hit played on radio stations across the country. The boy from Houston, who had trained in pain and pivoted from injury to injury, found himself, at 35, at the center of something enormous. But even as the world celebrated the dream version of what Dirty Dancing was, Patrick was sitting with the more complicated version he had actually lived. He didn't rush to correct the record. He understood that audiences needed the magic, and he wasn't interested in taking it from them. But in the years that followed, as he moved through Ghost and Point Break and a career that kept defying the boxes people tried to put him in, he carried those weeks in North Carolina with him. They had changed something in how he worked. The experience of making something imperfect that somehow became beautiful had loosened a knot in him. The perfectionists need to control every variable, to anticipate every outcome. Director Kenny Ortega had said something to him during filming that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He had told Patrick that Johnny Castle didn't need to be clean. He needed to be real. That the cracks in the armor were where the character lived. Patrick had resisted it at first because his entire training had been about closing those cracks. But somewhere between Jennifer's laughter and the unrehearsed lift and the weeks of tension that had somehow become chemistry, he had understood what Ortega meant. Vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the whole point. He carried that understanding into everything that followed. And when the diagnosis came in 2008, when the doctors sat him down and explained what stage 4 pancreatic cancer meant in the plainest terms they could find, he reached for it again. He kept working. He filmed a television series while undergoing treatment, showing up on set with the same discipline he had brought to every project, except now the fight wasn't just on screen. His wife Lisa, who had been beside him since they were teenagers in his mother's dance studio, was there through every treatment, every difficult night, every moment when the performance of being okay became genuinely hard to sustain. In the time he had left, Patrick spoke more openly than he ever had. about the fear he had carried for years and learned to move through, about the relationship with Jennifer Grey that had been so much harder than anyone knew, and how grateful he was for what came out of it, about the knee that had closed so many doors and opened others, about the lift and what it had meant and why he still thought about it. He said that what Dirty Dancing had taught him, really taught him in the way that stays, was that the best things rarely come from the most controlled conditions. They come from the edge, from the moment when you have run out of time to prepare and you have to simply go. He passed away on September 14th, 2009. He was 57 years old. In the months before the end, people who visited him at the ranch in New Mexico said he seemed at peace in a way that surprised them. He would sit by the window and watch the light move across the land. He wrote sometimes, and Lisa was always close. His final words to a close friend were short and certain. He said that Lisa had been his miracle. Not the films, not the fame, not the line or the lift, or any of the things the world had made into monuments. Her, the girl from his mother's ballet class, who had grown into the person who stood beside him through absolutely everything. The world remembers Johnny Castle, the man who put no one in corners and made an entire generation believe in summer and second chances. But the real Patrick Swayze was someone more interesting than that, someone who fought with his co-star and apologized for it, who had pain and admitted it later, who chased perfection and eventually learned to let it go. Someone who made one of the most beloved films in American cinema out of friction and fear and a single unrehearsed leap of faith. That's the story he finally told. Not the polished one, the real one. And somehow, it's even better. If this moved you, if Patrick's story reminded you of something true about the distance between how things look and how they actually feel, leave a comment below. And if you want more stories told the way they actually happened, subscribe. We'll be here.